Hello YouTube and welcome to an all new Elder Scrolls lore video. Today we're talking about sex and sexual customs on Tamriel, and just in general all the lore around sex which has to do with Tamriel's races. Now, fans of this channel may know that I covered this subject once before 5 years ago, but in the 5 years since we have gotten a literal boatload of new lore on the subject. This is a serious lore video, by the way, not just a meme video, so that's just for clarification. And this video contains all the content that's still relevant to the original video, so no need to go and watch that again. So, both hands on your phone or your keyboard, let's talk about sex. So, sex, or professionally speaking, intercourse. Just like in the real world, in the Elder Scrolls world, mortals have intercourse with one another for both pleasure and procreation. First, let's talk about procreation, as there's some info that you need to know on the biological side before we can talk about the customs. So, just like in the real world, intercourse between a male and a female of a species is used for the production of offspring of children. If you don't know the specifics, I highly recommend checking out the biology textbook, as I am your Elder Scrolls lore YouTuber, not your sexual education teacher, but if you really aren't in the know here, I've got a visual representation for you. Right. Now, it's generally understood that any human race on Tamriel, or race of man, can procreate without issue with any other human race. So, an Imperial can procreate with Nords, Bretons and Redguards without any issues. And the general rule of thumb is that in the Elder Scrolls universe, the child will have the race of the mother. So, a female Redguard mating with a male Nord will generally result in a Redguard child most of the time, although it seems that this process is not flawless, as we have some very specific examples of cases where the race of the father resulted in child, and even some examples of half-breeds in which a child has traits of both races. But these cases are quite rare and a topic all on themselves, but the rule of thumb is that the race of the mother is the race of the child, and that generally works. Even when any of the races of elves or races of Mer procreate with one of the races of man, so the humans. It's understood that while the chances of pregnancy seem to be slightly lower in a union between a mare and a man, all races of elves, including the orcs, can very much have offspring with all races of humans. By the way, the fact that fertility seems to be a bit harder in a union between Mer and man seems to have nothing to do with the supposed lower fertility of elves, as elves are just as fertile as humans, as the chances of pregnancy in a union between any of the elvish races, so for example an Altmer and an Altmer, an Altmer and a Bosmer, seems to be similar to the chances of pregnancy in an all-human union. That being said, some elven pairings do get children very rarely, especially in High Elf or Altmer culture. But that likely has more to do with the longer lifespans and the specifics of their culture, as we see other races of elves, especially the Bosmer or the Wood Elves, proving that having children in quick succession is very much possible with an elven union. But I'm getting off track here, as we will talk about the sexual customs of both the High Elves and the Wood Elves later in this video. Anyway, back to procreation. The issue of interracial procreation gets slightly more complicated when talking about the Khajiit, as far as I'm aware we have no examples of a Khajiit union with a man or a Mer producing offspring in the games or the lore, although there are in-universe sources who claim that Khajiit are able to have children specifically with the elvish races, or the races of Mer. This in turn strengthens the theory that the Khajiit may share a common ancestor, likely the so-called non-wandering Elmufei, with the races of elves, placing them genetically closer to the elves and the humans, explaining why Khajiit elf unions seem to be possible for producing offspring, but Khajiiti human unions are not. But the whole debate about Khajiiti origins is a whole different can of worms, not for this video, so for now it's enough to know that Khajiit are unable, as far as we know, to produce children with humans, but apparently they are able to produce offspring in very rare cases with elves. Now, finally we have the Argonians, who are just completely different biologically to any other intelligent race on Tamriel, making it so that they cannot produce children with any of the other races, as far as we know, under normal circumstances, but we'll get to that a bit later in the video when we come to the Argonians. Now, one final note on the biological aspect of procreation in the Elder Scrolls universe is that while humans, just like in our world, enter puberty and thus become fertile around the age of 12, for the elvish races that seems to be generally slightly later, as they enter puberty and thus become fertile around the age of 19. That being said, sex in our world is not just practiced for procreation and is not just a biological subject, but is also for pleasure and for affection. Now, just like in the real world where sex has a different place in basically any culture, this also goes for the Elder Scrolls universe. Each race has their own sexual customs and views on intercourse, so let's talk about that now for a bit. First of all, depending on an individual's beliefs, sex can have a religious connotation on Tamriel, as certain sects of the worshippers of, for example, the goddess Dibella, the goddess of love, beauty and affection, and lust, tend to use sexual activities as a part of devout worship of the goddess, and the people of Tamriel often have little shrines or amulets of Dibella in their bedrooms, supposedly to increase their sexual performance. Having intercourse as a devout follower of Dibella is, by the practitioner, seen as a way of honoring the goddess. In some circles of the worshippers of Dibella, it's even customary to wear masks during the sexual activities, so as to bestow anonymous love upon others, which is likely seen as a more pure form of worship, as the intercourse then does not have to involve direct attraction to the person that you're sleeping with, but rather is just a form of pure passion in service to Dibella. Some sects of Dibella even take this a step further by providing instructions into pleasure to the people of Tamriel. So basically sex lessons to the people of Tamriel. Now, while these lessons are described as introductions into pleasure, I can also imagine them functioning a bit like sex ed lessons, where some do's and don'ts are also described regarding stuff like STDs, which are very much a thing on Tamriel, as I discovered in this video on the STDs of Tamriel. Interesting stuff, and it really makes me question my life choices when I utter sentences like these aloud. Anyway, link to the STD video is in the description. Pretty interesting all around. Now, I need to note here that Dibella has several sects of worship, with only very few of them actually using sex as a regular method of worship. Most Dibellan religious sects do not practice intercourse as their preferred way of worship, although they do all acknowledge that Dibella is the patron goddess when it comes to intercourse, and that by practicing it you are honoring her. So it's just that a minority of Dibellan sects actually uses sex as their primary worship method. So keep that in mind, that not every temple of Dibella is just a place to have sex. That said, Dibella isn't the only deity associated with intercourse. Specifically, the Daedric prince Sanguine, the Daedric lord of lust, revelry and perversity, has sex in his domain, with some quite literally calling him the lord of unnatural sexual relations. His specific domains is that of forbidden love, taboo and perverse excesses. His followers often engage in sexual activities among one another to worship the Daedric lord, but unlike Dibella, intercourse in the worship of Sanguine doesn't really involve love, but involves both pain and pleasure. And as I'm writing this script, I realize perhaps going into further description will most likely have YouTube set the demonetization ninjas upon me, if they haven't been set out already. So yeah, knowing his is the realm of the taboo, excess, pain and pleasure, you should have enough information to ascertain the exact ways of worship that his followers employ by yourself. Now, another Daedric prince that counts sex within their domain is the Daedric prince Mephala, the Daedric prince of murder, secrets and seduction. Now, it's known that sex in groups is apparently one way to worship Mephala, and her followers and cultists often have initiation rituals which are sexual in nature. Some outsiders view cults of Mephala as debauched sex clubs, something which a cultist of Mephala confirms in a lore book. Now, in addition to that, cultists of Mephala often learn various methods of seduction and often employ it when carrying out tasks for the cult by seducing their targets. Some of Mephala's cults even have books filled with both seduction tactics and sensual arrangements for worship. Now, a final goddess that's associated with sex is Morrowind, the Yokudan goddess of fertility. Like Dibella, she is associated with lust, although to a lesser extent, as her domain mainly covers the procreation aspect of intercourse instead of the pleasure side. Worship of her often centers around her breasts, and as such she is often portrayed with quite a large bosom. Now, according to the lorebook Varieties of Faith, in most of her depictions she often has 4 arms instead of 2 to quote-unquote grab more husbands. Now, generally speaking, all these religious aspects of sex you can encounter all across Tamriel, with the exception of Morrowind worship, who is mainly worshipped in Hammerfell. Now, these are mostly non-race or culture specific, as worshippers of these different deities can be encountered in basically every corner of Tamriel, so their specific aspects, if they belong to one of these sects, is generally found in every culture, so they might not even align with the culture that they're in terms of their view on sex. Now, incidentally, something that we also find in every corner of Tamriel is erotic art, performances and literature. According to the lore, there are countless works of arousing writing on Tamriel, with probably the most well-known example of course being the lusty Argonian Maid, which is an erotic play meant to either be performed by erotic actors or to be read by individuals for whatever reason. Now, in fact, back when Twitter's account of the Elder Scrolls Online roleplayed as Hermaeus Mora, the Daedric Prince of Knowledge, as a little marketing thing for the Elder Scrolls Online Necrom, they even said as Hermaeus Mora that there is so much erotic literature on Tamriel, which eventually ends up in Apocrypha, Hermaeus Mora's realm where he collects all the knowledge, that he now is just using all the erotic literature as structural support for his realm, instead of just adding it to his collection, as they are pretty much worthless to him. Now, in select houses across Tamriel, we can also find all sorts of erotic toys, which I won't describe out of demonetization fear, but just trust me that we find them all across Tamriel, and that each culture seems to be having them, like handcuffs or large tusks of things, which I won't describe what they are used for. But yeah, each culture basically has erotic literature, sex toys, and most cultures seem to also have sexual stimulants, from spells to magical artifacts to incenses, all designed to improve sexual performance. That being said, some cultures do have some peculiarities and interesting facts about them. So let's start talking about the Bretons. As we know for a fact that Breton nobility is actually quite sexually active and is seemingly even the biggest market for illegal sexually enhancing incenses and drugs. That being said, the nobility is not the only ones who are sexually active. According to an unreliable source, Breton culture in general is a bit more loose when it comes to sex than some of their other human counterparts. This can also be seen in their druid circles, as we have examples of Breton druids actually using sexually arousing magic. One such example we can even see in the Elder Scrolls Online, where a magical druid artifact makes everyone in the vicinity of an entire village basically permanently aroused and causing everyone in the area to engage in basically non-stop intercourse. Although the handling of this quest is done a bit jokingly and we never actually witness anything, of course, but just all the characters in the area are extremely forward and are permanently trying to get in each other's pants, so that was pretty fun. Apparently this artifact was originally used as a way to spice up a druidic ritual of life, which celebrated sexual unions. I mean, pretty interesting stuff, but that's all part of Breton culture. Now, one other, a bit more disturbing thing that we do know about the Bretons is that there are some mentions of inbreeding in the circles of their nobility. Just like in feudal Europe, it seems that some kings and other nobles keep it all in the family in order to secure the bloodline and keep power within the family. That being said, this doesn't seem to occur very frequently in the Elder Scrolls universe, and when we encounter it, it's mostly just unreliable sources which could have very well been fabricated to slander the lord or lady in question. But there are some indications that it actually happens in High Rock sometimes. Now, the final thing that we know is that nudity really isn't that big of a deal in High Rock. I mean, even prostitution in Breton culture is not really that big a deal. And the Prostitution's Guild of Tamriel seems to actually be doing really well and is really active in the Breton cities. In some cities even being considered a staple of the community. But I actually made a whole video on prostitution on Tamriel itself, so I suggest watching that if you wish to know more about how that's handled for each of the races and each of the nations, as I won't be covering prostitution in this video nearly as much, since this video is already really long and I don't like repeating myself. That being said, we also have sources telling us that sex and nudity is also viewed quite casually in Redguard culture, albeit in reality that this seems to differ per community and seems to be less pronounced than in High Rock, where basically everybody is really casual about it. But that's really all we know about the Redguards, other than the fact that some of the aforementioned communities, which exist all over Tamriel, likely also exist in Hammerfell, so there are Morrow worshippers there, and there are probably cultists of Sanguine and Mephala there, but yeah. By the way, the Reach, which is inhabited by the Reachmen and lies basically between High Rock, Hammerfell and Skyrim, also has some of its own sexual customs that we know very little about, other than the fact that it's apparently a great honor there to have sex with a Hagraven, so yeah. Now, a culture that we know a little bit more about, but still not a whole lot, is Imperial culture. Now, we know that in Cyrodiil, people are a bit less casual about sex and nudity than in Hammerfell and High Rock, but here as well, it's definitely not frowned upon in general. I mean, Imperials will generally just bring it up less naturally in conversations than, say, a Breton. That being said, we know that just like High Rock, Cyrodiil is a very profitable area for the Prostitutes Guild apparently, and the Bella is described as Cyrodiil's most popular god, with there apparently being quite some cults dedicated to her in lore. Again, not all of them are likely about having sex to worship, but there's probably some. And it seems that Imperial soldiers are allowed to bring erotic etchings with them in their personal belongings while far from home, as we can find one of those in ESO's contraband loot items. We also know that Hearts Day, which is this holiday celebrating love across Tamriel, seems to be an Imperial invention, or at least became mainstream in the Cyrodiilic empires and then spread over Tamriel. And during the days of the Third Cyrodiilic Empire, it was customary for inns to give free bedrooms to couples on Hearts Day, so yeah, cool. So next up are the Nords, and for the Nords, well, we know that they are less open than the Bretons and Imperials and Redguards when it comes to sex, with game examples showing us that people seem especially to disapprove of devout Debella worship by having intercourse instead of like honoring a shrine. That being said, sex seems to be really a behind closed doors topic within most Nordic communities, making them as such the most conservative and least casual human race as far as we can tell. The interesting thing is that we do have one example of a Nordic army in the Elder Scrolls Online employing a so-called morale officer, who is basically a prostitute traveling with the army to keep the soldiers' morale high. That was actually a first for me when I saw that, but you know, maybe after this video I might see it modded into Skyrim by someone somewhere. You know who you are if you're watching. Anyway, let's move on to the Elvish cultures, as generally we have more lore on them than on the human races. Let's start with the Bosmer, or Wood Elves, who are said to be very casual when it comes to sex, even more so than the Bretons. We have multiple examples where Bosmer specifically, including the Green Lady and the Sylvanar, who are, let's say, a really important set of figures in the Bosmer culture, to put it very mildly, just casually bringing it up and saying that they'd rather be doing sex than the thing that they are doing at the moment. It's also implied that in Bosmer marriages it's quite acceptable to just keep seeing people on the side. Not all Bosmer, of course, but it seems quite normal in Valenwood to have multiple partners. And on top of that, Bosmer families often get an average of 12 children in a family. Even their religion and their myths tend to contain way more sexual themes than they do in most other cultures, often drawing their deities in erotic manners. So yeah, definitely more relaxed about that part of life, especially when compared to, for example, the Altmer or the High Elves, who may as well be the most uptight and conservative race when it comes to sex. That's because at least traditionally oriented Altmer, of whom there are quite a lot according to the lore, are obsessed with bloodline and the purity of the offspring's race. Again, this does not mean that all High Elves are that way, a lot aren't, but in lore a lot of them are as well. In some very conservative Altmer circles, eugenics are apparently practiced, where if a child has deformities or traces of non-Altmer blood in them, they are labelled as Hulkins and are generally thrown out of the family as babies to either die or to be erased by the temples, and in some extreme circles these children are straight up killed by their families after coming into the world. Pretty dark stuff. I mean, these circles of Altmer society are so obsessed with their purity that even having sex with a Bosmer or a human can be compared to bestiality to them, and marrying a non-high elf can be enough to be just completely disowned in those circles. While, for example, inbreeding, while slightly frowned upon, is probably even preferable to marrying a non-Altmer in those circles. So especially in those circles, just casually having sex with someone is just very much frowned upon, and in Altmer society in general, it isn't an often openly discussed topic, with it being very much a private matter for the couple in question. Now, this whole eugenics business is often brought up in the lore community as a reason as to why the Altmer seem to have such a low procreation rate. Altmer couples who have a very long lifespan and are often together for long periods of time, I mean, we're often talking about centuries here, tend to only have 1 to 3 children, with 2 being the average. But I have to say, eugenics being the reason for that is quite unlikely in my opinion. You see, it's only a part of the Altmer population who is so extreme about this purity, and not only that, but the whole idea that Altmer have a lower fertility than humans and other types of elves also seems to mostly be untrue, as when an Altmer has a relationship with a human or Bosmer, the amount of children on average seems to be much higher. But I do have a very interesting speculative explanation for the low birth rate among Altmer. You see, as I've talked about in my video on love and marriage customs on Tamriel, link in the description if you haven't seen it, Altmer often engage in strategic and political marriages, especially in the higher and more conservative circles. This means that essentially, in a lot of marriages, these marriages are just loveless between the partners, and thus it would make very much sense if intercourse does not occur all that often in these marriages. On top of that, traditional Altmer tend to very much conform to the norms of society, so if the norm is 2 children, They may not necessarily want to have more, so they don't have to stand out in society and become a pariah in their community. This leads to some very interesting speculation that perhaps the Altmer, by far the most advanced culture in terms of magic, may have developed some form of magical birth control, perhaps in the form of a spell or a potion, meaning that even in loving marriages they can consciously keep the amount of children at bay, and in a loveless marriage they can secretly see as many lovers on the side as they want without producing any offspring. As producing offspring outside of marriage, especially in the more traditional circles, is likely very shameful and again probably enough to be disowned and kicked from the family, so that would make sense. Now let's move on to the Dark Elves, or the Dunmer. They are very similar to the Altmer, albeit multiple gradations less extreme than with the traditional Altmer. Sex is a topic that you don't really bring up in conversation in Dunmer society. It's a subject for behind closed doors, which you don't bring up and in some cases are even expected to lie about. For example, oral sex and sex through the back door, so to say, monetization, was forbidden under tribunal law in Morrowind, but almost everyone does it anyway. You're just expected not to bring it up and deny it if some form of law enforcement asks, which they never do. This creates this interesting duality that outside the house, Dunmer are generally very reserved and restrained and don't talk all that much about intercourse, while indoors the Dunmer have a reputation for being one of the more promiscuous cultures. Brothels are quite a common sight in Morrowind, but you don't talk about them, and from the outside they don't look like it. The religious works of the Dunmer, especially the Lessons of Vivec, have overtly sexual themes to them, but you don't talk about that on the street. They have quite a lot of erotic literature compared to the other races, but people are likely expected to say that they don't have copies and I don't know where I got it, that kind of thing. That being said, the traditional Dunmer are also quite serious about the whole purity thing. In some of the traditionalist circles it's considered heresy to mate or marry with a non-Dunmer, although it doesn't seem as extreme as the Altmer traditionalist, and they don't tend to practice eugenics as far as we know. Now, one bit of extra information that we have on the Dunmer is that it seems that they are, just like the High Elves, very conservative when it comes to the amount of children that they get. They too come in at an average of about 2 children, while their lifespans are very long, in some cases longer than that of the High Elves, so their population growth should equally be lower comparatively. Now, next up are the Orcs, or the Orsimer. Now, we don't know all that much about the sexual customs of the Orcs, other than that in traditional Orcish communities in the strongholds, only the chief is allowed to have the intercourse and reproduce according to the Code of Malakath. The chief therefore has many sexual partners, while the other male orcs in the strongholds are supposed to have none, although it's heavily implied that in especially bigger Orcish communities there are many unmarried or unofficially married couples behind closed doors. Now, furthermore, orcs who do not follow the Code of Malakath and rather worship the god Trinimach completely disregard the whole only the chief may have sexual partners thing and straight up just get married to whomever they want. One additional piece of information on Orcish sexual customs is that they have quite a few foods which they consider to be aphrodisiacs, which they consume before intercourse, while at the same time, as far as I could find, they are one of the races with the least amount of actual stimulants in the forms of drugs and incenses as are described to them, so that's nice for them. Alright, next up, the Khajiit. The Khajiit are quite an interesting bunch. For one, multiple sources describe the Khajiit as having barbed penises, making intercourse with Khajiit extremely painful for any non-Khajiit, and presumably also painful for other Khajiit. Now, second, they are one of the races which we actually know that they produce quite some pornographic items in terms of art and literature. They have a reputation for being quite promiscuous and pretty open about sex, which they call zoop zoop, by the way, in case you wanted to know. Now, in addition to their pretty open and casual attitude to sex, we know that the Khajiit are one of the races, together with the Bosmer and in some aspects the Argonians, who really just don't mind seeing other people on the side next to their partner. And yeah, they are one of the few races in which group-based intercourse is actually seen as pretty normal, apparently. So yeah, good stuff. One interesting thing here though is that since sex is also meant for procreation and not just for pleasure, I would think that the Khajiit likely time their sexual escapades consciously. Let me explain. There are many different types of Khajiit in the Elder Scrolls universe, and which type a baby Khajiit becomes is dependent on the stance of the moons during their birth. This determines everything about the type of Khajiit that they will become, from a small house cat-like Alfiq Khajiit to the large and mighty Sencharat. I would think that Khajiiti parents, considering the stances of the moons are predictable, would be able to time their time of intercourse in a way where they would be able to get the type of Khajiit child that they want. So it's possible that some Khajiit do that, but we have no actual confirmation of that, so it's just speculation from my side. But if you do want to know more about every type of Khajiit that we have and which stances of the moon lead to their births, be sure to check out my video on every type of Khajiit and the stances of the moon that they are conceived in. It's in the description of this video. Alright. Final race and culture are the Argonians. Now, the Argonians are quite an interesting race, in the sense that they are completely different biologically from all other of Tamriel's races. They were created by the Histries as their servants and protectors, and as such they are not descendants of the Almophae, or the original ones, which are said to be the far-off ancestor of every intelligent race on Tamriel. They are completely incompatible to procreate with any other race than themselves, with no offspring ever being recorded to naturally exist between an Argonian and another race on Tamriel. The only one we have is one couple in the Shivering Isles where it's told that Sheogorath himself, so a god, had to intervene to even make it possible, so no natural compatibility between the races and Argonians. But it is possible with some very heavy meddling of a god. That being said, Argonians were modeled after humanoids, and they have even been given sexual reproduction organs by the Hist, making it possible for them to have sex with any race on Tamriel. It just won't produce offspring. I'll give you one better even. While in general Argonians lay eggs as their method of reproduction, having eggs hatched by the Histries in their hatching pools, generally, the Hist have given Argonian females all the organs required for procreation as mammals, since the Hist can actually make it so that the Argonians can carry their own children and feed them themselves in periods of crisis where their hatching pools are not safe. This is why Argonian females have breasts, by the way. Now, even more interesting than this is that Argonian sex, so between two Argonians, generally doesn't lead to procreation and eggs being created, leading them to be quite casual about sexual pleasure in their relationships, as the only way to actually procreate seems to be mating in blessings of the Hist, which is actually done with elaborate rituals to find the strongest Argonians in combination who will get the best offspring when they mate together. This means that Argonians usually mate and get children with people of whom they are far from interested in romantically and usually don't even know. Again, there are exceptions to these kind of rules and traditions, as with all of the previously spoken about cultures, but it's pretty interesting. I actually described this ritual finding a mate in some detail in my video on marriage and love customs. Again, link in the description if you want to take a look. Now, one final interesting tidbit is that procreation is meant to be done under the watchful eye of the Hist. Then why is it so that Argonians have a sex drive at all outside of that ritual? Like, why were they designed by the Hist to actually want to do it for pleasure? I mean, just like the other races, we have examples of Argonian erotica in literature and art. So, yeah, pretty weird and pretty interesting. That being said, that was basically all that we know about the sexual customs of the different races and cultures on Tamriel, and I truly hope that you learned something new today about the Elder Scrolls lore. And if you did, maybe return for the next Elder Scrolls lore video or subscribe to the channel. As for myself, I'm just glad that I managed to keep all my hands above the table during the making of this video, so Todd may be proud of me. Anyway, it's time to end the video, so all that's left for me to do is now to vocally thank my top Patreon supporters: Mr. Bernardo Binda, Gabriel Binda, Polar Rasputin, Athena Iodis, Volkier of Argonia, King Chris, Bolt, Scrap of the Scrolls, Doji, Fenrir, Sword of Bushido, Rakai, Zarmakal, and Mr. Christmas. It's thanks to these people and all the others on screen that this channel stays alive, and for that I'm very grateful. That said, I hope to see all of you in the next Elder Scrolls lore video. Bye bye.